In the quiet town of Cedar Ridge, nestled between pine forests and misty hills, Daniel Harris sat alone in his dimly lit living room. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, but inside, the silence was heavier, broken only by the faint hum of an old radio. Daniel, a retired high school history teacher, had spent the last 3 weeks listening to static, waiting for something he wasn't sure still existed. He was 72 years old, with thin white hair and hands that trembled slightly when he poured his morning coffee. His house was small but tidy, filled with books, framed photos, and the lingering scent of lavender, Maria's favorite. She had been gone for nearly a year now, taken by a quiet illness that moved faster than anyone expected. Since then, Daniel had kept to himself, speaking only to the mail carrier or the occasional neighbor who stopped by with soup or bread. But every night at exactly 9 o'clock, he turned on the shortwave radio that sat on his wooden desk. It was an old model, the kind with dials and knobs bought decades ago at a flea market. Maria had loved it. She used to say it connected them to the world beyond their little town. Now it was Daniel's only link to anything that felt real. Earth had changed, not with explosions or wars, but with silence. The great networks had gone dark one by one. First the internet, then the satellites, then the emergency broadcasts. Governments had collapsed not with violence, but with exhaustion. Resources ran low. People drifted away, seeking shelter in larger cities or underground bunkers. Cedar Ridge, once home to 300 souls, now held fewer than 20. Most had left without saying goodbye. Daniel stayed because Maria had wanted to. "This is where we built our life," she'd said during her last good days. "I want to leave it from here." So he honored her wish. And now, night after night, he spoke into the radio's microphone, not knowing if anyone could hear him, but speaking anyway. "Hello out there," he said softly, his voice rough but warm. "It's Daniel again, from Cedar Ridge. Just wanted to say, Maria would have loved tonight. The stars are clear. The air smells like rain and pine. She always said nights like this made the world feel gentle." He paused, glancing at her photo on the desk. She smiled back at him, frozen in time, wearing that blue dress she wore on their 40th anniversary. He touched the frame gently, then continued. "I made her favorite soup today, lentil and thyme. I burned the onions a little, like I always do." She used to laugh and say, "Daniel, you can teach world history, but you can't chop an onion without setting off the smoke alarm." He chuckled, then fell quiet for a moment. I miss her laugh. Miles above Earth, in the cold vacuum of space, a signal flickered to life on a distant monitor. Aboard the Galacticx observation post orbiting the dead moon of Kalis 7, Technician Marn veered from her console. She wasn't supposed to be monitoring human frequencies. The species had been marked inactive by Central Command. But something in the tone of the voice caught her attention. It wasn't panicked. It wasn't begging. It was calm, almost peaceful. She tapped her comm. "Commander Elira, you might want to hear this." Elira Vox, a sharp-eyed strategist with silver markings along her temples, entered the chamber. She listened as Daniel's voice filled the room. "I don't know if anyone's listening. Maybe no one is left who can. But if you are, be kind to someone today, even if it's just a smile." Maria always said kindness was the only thing that didn't need batteries. Elira stood very still. The Galacticx had studied humanity for over a century. They'd watched wars, greed, destruction. They'd logged every act of cruelty, every failed peace treaty, every collapse. They'd concluded that humans were emotionally unstable, inefficient, and ultimately self-terminating. They'd even drafted a final report titled Species Termination Natural Conclusion. But this was something they hadn't recorded before. Not in their vast archives, not in any simulation. A human, alone, facing the end, choosing to speak of love instead of fear. "Trace the signal," Elira ordered. Within minutes, they had it. A single dwelling in the northern temperate zone of Earth. Sector Gamma 9, population estimate 1. The rest of the continent showed no active power grids, no comms, no movement. "He's the last one talking," Marn said quietly. Elira didn't respond right away. She replayed the message. Again and again, each time the words settled deeper. She had been taught that emotion clouded judgment. That attachment weakened resolve. Yet here was a being utterly alone, radiating something the Galacticx had no word for, something that felt like strength wrapped in softness. Back on Earth, Daniel turned off the radio. He walked to the window and looked up at the sky. The stars were bright, undimmed by city lights or pollution. He imagined Maria up there somewhere watching, "Good night, my love," he whispered. "I'll talk to you tomorrow." He didn't know that his voice had traveled farther than any human signal in decades. He didn't know that in a sterile chamber light years away, a species that prided itself on logic was beginning to question everything they thought they knew about courage. Daniel went to bed, the house creaking softly around him. Outside, an owl called. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. Life, however quiet, continued. And in the void between stars, a single transmission pulsed onward, carrying not data, not coordinates, not warnings, but a goodbye so gentle, it would soon shake an empire built on cold reason. The Galacticx had come to witness an extinction. Instead, they were about to receive a lesson they never asked for, from a man who had nothing left to give but the truth of his heart. The Galacticx Council convened in their crystalline chamber orbiting the star Zeta 9. The walls shimmered with living light, shifting colors based on the mood of the speakers. Today the hue was a sharp blue, indicating debate. At the center of the room, Commander Elira Vox stood before the high observatory, her posture straight, her voice calm but firm. "I have reviewed the transmission from Earth," she said. "It is not a distress call. It is not coded. It is simply a man speaking to his lost wife." She played the recording again. Daniel's voice filled the chamber, soft and steady. "He speaks of soup, of stars, of kindness, and he does it while his world ends around him." Elder Kor, his scaled brow furrowed, tapped a clawed finger on the arm of his seat. "Sentiment is noise," he declared. "Noise distracts from order. We have long known humans to be chaotic. This changes nothing." But not everyone agreed. Archivist Nile, usually silent during council sessions, leaned forward. "We have logged over 12,000 human transmissions in the last century. 98% were about conflict, fear, or survival. This is the first that speaks only of love after loss. Should we not understand why?" Elira nodded. "That is why I request permission to send a scout vessel. Not to intervene, only to observe, to learn what remains when everything else is gone." After hours of discussion, the council granted limited clearance. 1 vessel. No contact. No interference. Strictly observational. Elira accepted the terms and left the chamber with quiet urgency. Aboard the stealth scout ship, Silent Vow, preparations began. The vessel was small, built for silence and speed. Its hull designed to bend light and avoid detection. Its pilot was Lieutenant Jason McLean, a human raised off-world since childhood. His parents had been part of the last evacuation fleet from Earth, fleeing before the final collapse. Jason had never set foot on his homeworld. He knew it only through stories, old videos, and the ache in his mother's voice when she spoke of summer rain. He stood in the ship's ready room, staring at a screen showing Daniel's house, a tiny dot on a dying planet. Something about the man's voice felt familiar, not in words but in tone. It reminded him of his mother singing him lullabies when storms rolled through the colony dome. "You don't have to be brave all the time," she'd whisper. "Just be kind." Now Jason was being sent to watch a man do exactly that. The Silent Vow launched without fanfare. It slipped through the void like a shadow, its engines humming at frequencies too low for most sensors to catch. During the journey, Jason listened to Daniel's broadcasts again and again. Each time he felt a strange pull, not of duty but of connection. On Earth, Daniel continued his routine. He watered the few plants still alive in his garden. He fixed a loose step on the porch. He cooked simple meals and ate them at the same table where he and Maria had shared 40 years of breakfasts. Every night he spoke into the radio. "Today I saw a deer," he said one evening, "just standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. I didn't move. Neither did she. We just existed together for a minute." Maria would have loved that. She always said animals knew more about peace than people ever did. Light years away, Jason closed his eyes. He imagined that moment. The quiet understanding between man and creature. The stillness of a world slowing down. When the Silent Vow entered Earth's orbit, Jason activated the cloaking field. The planet below was not the vibrant blue marble shown in old archives. Oceans were duller, cities were dark. Forests had begun to reclaim roads and buildings, but Cedar Ridge still stood small and stubborn like a candle refusing to go out. Jason guided the ship to a hidden landing site in the hills above the town. He stepped onto the soil of Earth for the first time. The air was cool, clean, and carried the scent of pine and damp Ia. Earth, he took a deep breath. It felt different than the filtered air of the colonies. Real. Using a cloaked hoversuit, he moved silently toward Daniel's house. He didn't plan to speak, only to watch, to understand what made this man so different from the humans the Galacticx had studied. He found Daniel sitting on the porch, wrapped in a worn flannel blanket. The old man stared at the sky, a mug of tea steaming in his hands. Jason hid behind a cluster of trees watching. After a while, Daniel spoke, not into the radio, but to the night itself. "I think about what you'd say if you were here," he murmured. "You'd tell me to stop worrying, to enjoy the quiet. You always saw beauty in the small things. A bird's song, a warm cup, a shared silence." Jason's throat tightened. He had expected despair, anger, regret. But Daniel radiated something else. Acceptance, yes, but also gratitude, as if every breath was a gift, not a burden. Later that night, back in his ship, Jason recorded a personal log. "I don't know what we thought humans were," he said quietly. "But this man, he isn't broken by loss. He's shaped by love. And maybe that's the difference." His comms unit buzzed. It was Elira. "Status report," she said. "Observation ongoing," Jason replied. "But I think we got it wrong." All of it. Before she could respond, another message came through, urgent, encrypted. It was from the Central Command. "Council has reclassified human emotional broadcasts as destabilizing anomalies. All records to be purged. Initiate Protocol Omega-7 upon confirmation." Jason's blood ran cold. Protocol Omega-7 meant total erasure. Every trace of human culture, language, and history would be deleted from Galactic's databases. Not archived. Not studied. Erased. He looked toward Daniel's house, its porch light still glowing like a beacon in the dark. "Understood," he said into the comm, but his voice was hollow. He didn't move. He just watched the light. Somewhere inside that house, an old man whispered goodnight to a ghost, and somewhere in the stars, a species that valued logic above all else was about to delete the one thing they couldn't understand, but desperately needed to keep. Jason stood in the trees just beyond Daniel's yard, the wind rustling the leaves around him. His mission was clear: observe, record, leave. No contact, no interference. But the order from Central Command echoed in his mind like a warning bell. Erase all human records. Delete everything. Including this quiet man's voice, his stories, his love for a woman named Maria. It felt wrong. Deeply wrong. He thought of his mother again. She had kept a small box of earth soil in their off-world home. "Just in case I forget what home smells like," she'd said. She never opened it. She just kept it on the shelf next to her old photo albums. Jason had never understood why until now. Some things weren't meant to be used. They were meant to be remembered. He took a slow breath and stepped out from the trees. He walked toward the house, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path. The porch light flickered as he approached. Daniel looked up from his chair, not startled, just curious. "Evening," Daniel said, his voice calm. "Evening," Jason replied. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, hands in his pockets. "Sorry to show up like this. Didn't mean to intrude." Daniel studied him for a moment. He saw the strange cut of Jason's coat, the odd boots, the way he held himself, like someone used to watching more than speaking. But he didn't ask questions. Instead, he nodded toward the empty chair beside him. "You look like you could use a seat. And maybe some tea." Jason hesitated, then climbed the steps and sat down. The wood creaked under his weight. Daniel poured tea from a thermos into a chipped mug and handed it to him. The warmth spread through Jason's fingers. "You're not from around here," Daniel said gently. "No," Jason admitted. "Not really." They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars. Crickets sang in the grass. A breeze carried the scent of wildflowers from the edge of the garden. "You remind me of someone," Daniel said after a while. "My nephew, Ben. He left years ago before things got bad. Always had that same look in his eyes, like he was carrying something heavy but didn't want to talk about it." Jason looked down at his mug. "Maybe we all carry something," Daniel nodded. "True enough. But you don't have to carry it alone, even if it's just for a night." Those words hit Jason harder than he expected. He had spent his life among aliens who valued control, precision, silence. Emotions were managed, not shared. But here, in this quiet house on a dying world, an old man offered kindness like it cost nothing. "I heard you on the radio," Jason said finally. "Your messages." Daniel smiled faintly. "Figured no one was listening, just helps me feel like she's still here." She was important to you, the most, Daniel said simply. We weren't rich, didn't travel the stars or change the world, but we changed each other, and sometimes that's enough. Jason thought about that. The Galacticx measured worth in achievements, in logic, in survival, but Daniel measured it in moments. Shared meals, quiet walks, holding hands during thunderstorms. People think kindness is weakness, Daniel went on, but it's not. It takes more courage to be kind when everything's falling apart than to be angry. Anger is easy. Kindness? That's a choice. Jason's comms unit buzzed softly in his pocket. He ignored it. He knew what it was. The final order to return, to comply, to let the purge happen. But for the first time, he didn't care about orders. Tell me about her, he said. And Daniel did. He spoke of Maria's laugh, how it sounded like wind chimes on a summer day. He told stories of her stubbornness, how she'd argue with store clerks over expired coupons, how she once drove 3 hours to return a lost wallet to a stranger. He talked about the way she'd hum while cooking, how she'd leave notes in his lunchbox even when he was 70. She believed people were good, Daniel said, even when they weren't. She said everyone's fighting a battle we can't see. So be gentle. Jason listened, his eyes stinging. He thought of the Galacticx archives, cold, sterile, filled with data but no heart. What would they lose if they erased this? Not just words, but proof that love could outlast everything. You should go, Daniel said gently, noticing Jason's distant look. You've got somewhere to be, don't you? Jason shook his head. Nowhere that matters more than this. Daniel patted his knee. Well then, stay a while. The night's still young. They talked until the stars shifted in the sky. Jason didn't tell Daniel who he really was or where he came from. He didn't need to. In that moment, they were just two people sharing a quiet truth, that even at the end, connection mattered. When Jason finally stood to leave, Daniel handed him a small jar. Inside were dried wildflower seeds. Maria planted these every spring, he said. Said they made people smile without asking for anything in return. Take them. Maybe they'll grow somewhere new. Jason took the jar, his fingers brushing Daniel's wrinkled hand. Thank you. No, Daniel said. Thank you for listening. As Jason walked back to the trees, he knew what he had to do. He couldn't stop the purge alone, but he could make sure Daniel's voice wasn't lost. He activated his ship's backup transmitter and began uploading everything. Every word, every story, every quiet moment, into an unlisted data stream, hidden inside old music files and weather reports. If the Galacticx deleted the official records, this copy would survive in the noise. Back aboard the Silent Vow, he sent one final message to Elira. Don't let them erase us. Not all of us. Then he looked down at the house one last time. The porch light still glowed, soft and steady, like a promise. And in that light, Jason understood the real lesson. Not how to survive the end, but how to live until the very last breath. Back aboard the Silent Vow, Jason transmitted everything. Audio, visuals, his own testimony. He sent it not through official channels, but through a hidden frequency used only by archivists and historians. It was a risk. If caught, he could be stripped of rank, even imprisoned. But he didn't care. What Daniel had shared was too important to lose. The message reached Elira Vox just as she entered the central chamber for an emergency session. The council had convened early. Protocol Omega-7 was set to activate in 6 hours. All human data, language files, art, music, personal logs would be wiped from every Galacticx database. Elder Core stood at the podium, his voice firm. Emotion breeds instability. Humanity's collapse proves it. We preserve nothing that weakens logic. Elira said nothing. She waited until the session adjourned, then played Jason's transmission in private. She listened as Daniel spoke of Maria's wildflowers, of burnt onions, of deer in the woods. She heard the quiet strength in his voice, the absence of fear, the presence of love. Then she heard Jason's raw, trembling words. They weren't weak. They were brave in a way we've never understood. She made her decision. The next morning, Elira called for a full council recall. She stood before them not as a commander, but as a witness. I ask you to listen, she said. Not as strategists, not as judges, but as beings who once felt something before we learned to silence it. She played Daniel's final broadcast. The room fell still. Even Elder Core did not interrupt. When it ended, Archivist Niall spoke first. In all our records, we have never documented a species choosing tenderness at the end. Why? Because we assumed tenderness had no purpose, Elira replied. But what if it does? What if it's the last thing that holds a soul together when everything else is gone? Debate erupted. Some called it sentimental nonsense. Others admitted they had never considered that love could be a form of resistance. One young council member, barely past training, whispered, "My mother used to sing to me when I was scared. I forgot how that felt until now." Elira pressed her advantage. "We study civilizations to learn from them. If we erase this, we erase the very lesson we were meant to receive." Elder Core remained silent for a long time. Then he stood. All eyes turned to him. He was the oldest among them, a veteran of 3 galactic purges, a believer in order above all. He looked at the recording one last time. Daniel's wrinkled hands, his soft eyes, the way he smiled when saying Maria's name. "I do not understand this emotion," Core said slowly, "but I will no longer dismiss what I cannot measure." His words stunned the chamber. With his support, the motion passed. Protocol Omega-7 was suspended. All human cultural records would be preserved, not as relics of failure, but as evidence of something rare and valuable. Meanwhile, on Earth, Daniel did not know any of this. He woke to soft rain tapping on the roof. He made coffee, fed the birds on the porch, and watered Maria's flower patch, though only a few stubborn blooms remained. That evening, he sat at his desk, the radio on. "Hello again," he said. "It rained today, the kind that makes everything smell clean. I thought of you the whole time. You always loved rain." His voice was weaker than before, but steady. He spoke of nothing grand, just small joys, small memories. He told a story about the time Maria tried to bake a cake for his birthday and forgot the sugar. "We ate it anyway," he chuckled. "Said it tasted like love with extra flour." He paused, breathing slowly. "I'm tired now, my love. But I'm okay, because you taught me how." He turned off the radio, placed Maria's photo in his lap, and closed his eyes. Outside, the rain softened. Inside, his breath grew quiet, then still. He passed peacefully in his sleep, a gentle end to a gentle life. His last words, captured by Jason's hidden mic, were whispered like a secret to the stars. "Goodbye, my love. Thank you for teaching me how to say it softly." Jason, orbiting high above, felt the silence before the sensors confirmed it. The house's power signature faded. The porch light went out. He didn't move for a long time. Then he activated the ship's comm. "He's gone," he said, his voice thick. Elira's reply came quickly. "We heard his last words. The Council has voted. Humanity will not be forgotten." Jason looked down at the dark house. He never knew. "Maybe that's why it mattered," Elira said softly. In the days that followed, the Galacticx began the work of preservation, not just saving files but studying them. Schools introduced new lessons, on human poetry, on lullabies, on the meaning of a shared meal. Historians rewrote their conclusions. Philosophers debated what it meant to be strong, and in quiet corners of the Empire, beings who had been taught to suppress feeling began to speak their truths aloud. Back on Zeta 9, Elira stood before a newly created exhibit in the Central Archive. At its heart was a simple audio player. Beside it, a plaque read, "The Softest Goodbye and the Loudest Lesson." She pressed play. Daniel's voice filled the room. She closed her eyes and listened. For the first time in years, she let herself feel without judgment. And in that moment, the galaxy began to change. Not with force, not with war, but with the echo of one man's love, spoken into the dark, and finally heard. Years passed. The stars turned, and across the vast territories of the Galacticx, something quiet began to grow. It started in small ways. On space stations, in learning halls, even in military outposts. Beings who once spoke only in facts and orders now paused to ask, "How are you?" Not as a formality, but as a real question. They began to share stories over meals. They held silence together without shame. They cried when they needed to. This change had no grand name. No official decree announced it. But everyone knew where it came from. They called it the Cedar Ridge Effect, though few had ever seen Earth. What mattered was the voice. The soft, steady voice of a man named Daniel Harris, who chose love when there was nothing left to gain. In the central archive of Zeta 9, Daniel's final broadcast played on a loop inside a quiet room lined with wildflower images. Visitors came from all corners of the Alliance just to listen. Some stood in silence. Others wept. Children sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes wide, hearing for the first time that kindness could be a kind of courage. Jason McLean, now an ambassador for cultural memory, walked through the archive often. He wore a simple coat, no rank insignia, just a small pin shaped like a wildflower. He spoke to students, to elders, to curious minds. He never claimed to be a hero. He only said he was lucky enough to witness something true. One spring morning, he stood beside Commander Elira Vox at the unveiling of a new memorial. It was not made of metal or crystal, but of living stone and real soil shipped from Earth's last preserved samples. Carved into its surface were two names, Daniel and Maria Harris. Around the base, wildflowers bloomed, planted from the very seeds Daniel had given Jason that night on the porch. "They never knew they saved us," Elira said, her voice low. Jason looked at the flowers swaying in the gentle breeze of the archive garden. "Maybe that's the point. Kindness doesn't need an audience. It just needs to exist." Elira nodded. She remembered the council chamber, the cold blue light the moment she first heard Daniel speak. She had thought she was studying a dying species. Instead, she had been given a mirror. And in it, she saw what her own people had lost, the ability to say goodbye with love instead of fear. Now, every year on the anniversary of Daniel's last broadcast, the Galacticx observed a quiet day. No meetings, no drills, no data analysis, just reflection. Families gathered, friends shared memories, strangers offered small gifts, a cup of tea, a handwritten note, a single flower. It was called the Day of Soft Voices. On one such day, a young Galactic student named Telly stood before her class. She held a small recorder. "My grandmother heard Daniel's voice when she was my age," she said. She said it was the first time she understood that sadness and love can live in the same breath. She played a clip, Daniel saying, "I miss her laugh." The room fell silent. Then one by one, the students began to share their own losses, their own loves. No one interrupted. No one judged. They just listened. Far away, on a restored patch of earth now protected as a living museum, a caretaker named Luis tended to Daniel's old house. It stood exactly as it had. Porch light still working, garden full of wildflowers. Tourists came, but they walked softly. They sat on the steps and listened to the wind. Sometimes Luis would play Daniel's recordings over a small speaker. Visitors would close their eyes and imagine a world where people stayed kind, even at the end. Back on Zeta 9, Jason and Elira walked through the memorial garden after the ceremony. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the stone. A breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers. "Do you think he'd be proud?" Jason asked. "I think he wouldn't care about pride," Elira replied. "He'd just be glad we're trying." They sat on a bench beneath a tree grown from an earth sapling. For a while they said nothing. They just watched the light fade, comfortable in the quiet. In that moment, the galaxy was not ruled by logic alone. It was held together by something softer, something stronger, by the memory of a man who spoke to his wife in the dark, not because he hoped to be heard, but because love deserved to be spoken, even if no one answered. And so the lesson lived on, not in laws or codes, but in everyday choices, a shared smile, a patient ear, a hand held in silence. The Galactic had come to witness an extinction. Instead, they inherited a legacy, and though Earth was quiet now, its final voice echoed louder than any war cry, any command, any empire ever built, because the softest goodbye had taught them the loudest truth, that to love, even when all is lost, is the bravest thing a being can do.